All right, welcome everyone. We are Lakshmi. I'm Lakshmi, and this is Callie. And we'll kind of introduce ourselves and our topic and kind of get started. So, my name is Lakshmi Balasubramanian, and I'm a researcher and lecturer at Stanford University. And I completed my PhD at Berkeley. Go Bears! I did that at Stanford yesterday. The undergrad class looked at me like, what? So I did my PhD in special education in UC Berkeley and SFSU, the Joint Doctoral Program. And I've focused my work on building inclusive practices. My dissertation focused on looking at system level processes and programmatic structures that build and sustain inclusive practices. I did that work in a local school district in the Bay Area with about 40,000 students and looked at their K-12 practices around inclusion. So I've done this work for about 17 years, the last 5 at Stanford. I run one of the research labs at Stanford and do a lot of research around building model demonstration projects around how to coach general ed and special ed teachers. Of course, we're doing work in AI now, everyone is, and looking at how do we build reading comprehension tools to support students with intellectual and developmental disabilities, because my focus has been the fact that with all of this technology, a lot of our students get left behind. And we then tend to design, and retrofit the tools for them instead of designing them proactively with students with learning differences in mind. I've looked at what are the barriers and facilitators for inclusive education, and that has really kind of been the work that drives me every day and that makes me wake up and want to do this. But I do want to share with you my positionality as it relates to the work that we're going to present today, but also how it's influenced who I am and what I've become. So, and that's influenced by my own identity as a disabled woman of color, and and my role as a researcher and a special education teacher, and my views about inclusive education. I'm partially blind with very low vision, no night vision, and complete loss of peripheral vision. My own educational journey affected my values, assumptions. It afforded me the opportunity to understand how it feels to never see what was written on the board. And my repeated pleas were met with open your eyes fully, or you need new glasses. And I'm like, my eyes are as wide open as possible. There's nothing more I can do. And it is salient to note that I was not educated here. So I grew up in India and in the Middle East, and accommodations for the disabled were rare, if not entirely absent. And so the the knowledge of how I see the world has prompted people to verbalize pity, give me empathy. They'd awkwardly laugh, or they'd raise their voice as though that would help me see better. I'm like, no, it's not helping. I consider myself to be a strong advocate for disability rights, which propels my interest in and commitment to inclusive education. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Callie to introduce herself and then take it back.
I really should have gone first. That's a tough act to follow. My name is Callie Turk. I have a few different identities that I'm bringing into this time with you today. The first is I am the co-founder of a nonprofit based here in Silicon Valley. We work with educators and parents to help them understand how to bridge the gaps between them in their communication and support of their neurodivergent and twice exceptional learners. So I spend a lot of time out talking to educators and also with families, and surrounded in a world that really is coming at this from a neurodiversity paradigm and really trying to attend to the wellness of all children by seeing them fully and completely as who they are and what they want to be for themselves. So that is a big part of what I'm bringing here today and why I really wanted to have this conversation with Lakshmi. I mean, putting this presentation was actually like as much me wanting to have a conversation and learn from Lakshmi as anything else. So you guys are just my excuse to spend time with her. So that's one part. The other part is coming as a doctoral student at the Bridges Graduate School of Cognitive Diversity and Education, where my research interests really focus on autistic people who present with internalizing autism, so those who might identify as female or just more as internalizing autism, as well as teacher professional development. So before I became a doctoral student and became a parent, I actually worked in teacher growth and professional learning for 15 years and come from a family of teachers and educators. My husband is a high school educator. So just really having a strong empathy and respect for the education professionals that I've encountered in multiple ways throughout my life, including those who have worked with my own children who have wanted to help them, but haven't always had the tools and resources that they needed to do so. So that drives a lot of my interests. Yes. Yes. So for a while, and if you're listening, there was even a show on this yesterday on NPR. We're looking at talking about the difference between male and female presentations of autism, and there's actually been a movement to think of that even differently because they're not always gender-based. There are more internalizing presentations is when you are masking more, camouflaging more, not intentionally, but you're socialized perhaps to do that, or you're by your temperament, you're going to internalize more and kind of direct a lot of that more as an anxiety experience. There don't have as many of the outward behaviors that have traditionally been thought of as what we're looking for when we give an autism diagnosis. So we do recognize now that there are people who identify as male who have that internalizing presentation and may not be identified as autistic until much later in life. There are people who are identified as female who have externalizing, and they will be identified when they're, very young. But there's this group of people with those internalizing behaviors that tend to be female identifying, but not always. And so we don't want to act like there's a binary. That's yeah. I also am coming to you today as a parent. I am the parent of 3 children. And they have highly influenced my interest in doing this work, taking all that I knew from my professional background and coming to you because one of them is autistic and quite a bright little thing. I'll tell you some of the stories about her sometime. Very interesting little lady. She's 18 now, and I have another 18-year-old and a 20-year-old who identifies as transgender and also probably undiagnosed autistic. So I'm bringing all of that here today as I think about ableism and how it's showing up in our communities, in our homes, in our schools. And yeah, I think that's it. Anything else? Yes. Yeah. Yes. So the slides are in the Padlet. They are in the Padlet. They should be. We might have made tweaks to them since I uploaded. I think so I can update them too.
Thank you, Callie. We'll go to the next slide. So this is our agenda for today. We're going to look at an introduction. What is ableism? Why does it matter? Look at how can we recognize ableism? Think of ableism and how do we disrupt that, a new lens. And how strengths disrupt ableism and using UDL to support strengths. And then we'll kind of open it up for Q&A. We're hoping to kind of wrap up the actual presentation faster so we can have time for discussion. But we've also included some activities within the presentation because we do want all of you all to share your wealth of knowledge and kind of share with the whole group. So that's kind of how we'll do it. I want to foreground our commitments. Our commitment is we see equity for all students as ensuring fair treatment, equality of opportunity, and fairness in access to education and resources. Next slide. Inclusion and rightful presence, builds a culture of belonging by actively seeking and valuing the participation and contribution of all students. Also just want to say that if you do raise your hand, do wave at me because I won't see you otherwise. I'm not trying to ignore you. All right. Okay, so what is ableism and why it matters? This is kind of what we'll go into right now. What is ableism? Ableism is this inherent view. It is discrimination. It's based on a person's perceived ability. At its root, ableism believes that there is a normal or there's something that is correct way to do something or be something, and that anything else is not good enough. right? So implying that there is a norm and that disabled people don't meet that norm. The whole word accommodations and modifications in itself gives me some feelings. So, and ableism can happen in any conversation. It's folded into language, it's in the way we do things, and it's, manifests in institutional practices. And we'll kind of go into that right now. Next slide. And how does ableism manifest, right? So let's look at the internalized ways in which ableism manifests. One is infantilization. Treating students with disabilities as if they were much younger than who they are. Like I've had high school students who use AAC devices, and the teacher will come and kind of pull their cheeks and say, "Oh, you're so cute." And that's really not appropriate, because that's not how we would talk to a teenager. My son would slap me if I did that to him. And of course, he's 6'4", right? Um, so that's one example, disregarding or devaluing for a disabled person's life. And we definitely will talk about language, and we use students with disabilities and disabled we use both terms because we want to honor and respect the identity first and person first. We'll go into that. The other one is questioning the validity of disability identity. I had a friend who was doing his PhD at Berkeley, and one of the faculty asked him, "Do you really need this to be scanned for you? Like, aren't you bright enough to read it yourself?" And he's dyslexic, right? So really kind of questioning, like, do you really need that accommodation? Assuming disability has a personal cause, example, laziness or lack of exercise. And then another one is, oh, sorry, we can actually go to the next slide. I forgot to delete those two. And this is another way ableism manifests, and this is interpersonal. In this, we look at things like inspiration porn, and I get this quite a lot as well. "Oh my gosh, you're so amazing. You can't see, but you still read a lot and do writing." I'm like, really? um, or or even the other thing is, saying things like, "Oh, this kid has such a significant disability. I mean, she looks disabled, but look, she's about to graduate." People, we disabled people don't really want pity, right? We want equal opportunity. We want fairness and access. Another one is looking at, and of course, microaggressions and high rates of violence that gets meted out to people with disabilities, right? Next one, institutional ways in which ableism manifests. Some of the ways is inaccessible spaces, unaddressed barriers in technology sometimes. I'm not really thinking about what those might be, and hiring and employment practices. This is a huge one. I have a friend, so I'm also on the board of a company called Relay Resources based in Portland, Oregon, and they, they're a nonprofit that work with hiring and placing people with disabilities in, and the whole goal is actually competitive integrated employment, right? And the CEO was sharing a story with us. Her son has an intellectual disability, and he was quietly fired when his supervisor changed, because they just didn't understand what his needs were or how to support him. So they just kept reducing his hours to a point where he was no longer needed, right? So these kinds of things do happen with people with disabilities. Next slide. So these are all the different ways in which ableism can present itself, right? We talked some of this, not considering accessibility with building design, right? And we really have to think about how can we relocate that problem of the disability, right? And rethink, why do we think in certain ways? And I think that's really important to kind of look as well. Presenting disability either as a tragedy or inspiration in media. Use of restraint as seclusion. This happens in educational settings as well as in hospital settings. So these are some of the ways in which ableism presents itself. Next slide. All right. Do you want to speak to this? Yes.
So this is a great little video from Ableism Ontario. No, wait, Inclusion Ontario. I find that our Canadian friends have a lot of great resources on inclusion and autism. We can't play the video for you because it'll be all garbled, and they've explained to us it's because of Apple's copyright little strategies. So I've put a link to this video. Sometimes it will help people to see a video to have these things explained, and so we wanted to make sure to make that accessible to you. It's in the Padlet if you want to look at that.
And I think, a lot of you will probably take this information back to your schools or other agencies. And sometimes it's really nice to have a video to kind of explain some of that. All right. So I'm going to give you, in the next few minutes, I'll kind of lay out the history of schooling and how it was used as a system to sort people by ability and how students with disabilities have been marginalized. And in the past century, what, how, and who schools educate has undergone massive changes, right? In the 21st century, the goal of education is very different from the earlier times. But the idea of scientific management became popular in the 1900s, and this involved standardizing work, which is kind of why I put the factory picture, for the utmost efficiency, and many of these ideas percolated into education. The challenge of providing education to the masses was compared to the running of factories, and many school administrators were working to bring the notion of scientific management into schools. And this assembly line approach was brought into education, right? Where students were viewed as raw materials that needed to be fashioned into the end product by teachers, and administrators were there to kind of evaluate the work that the teachers were doing on how efficient were they in getting them to the end product. And the notion of efficiency governing how schools were run can be credited to Thorndike, okay, now who's considered a pioneer in education, sarcasm there, because he believed that the main goal of education was to sort people by ability so that they could be assigned the correct work that they could do in their life, right? Suited to their ability level. And this, he believed, would be a proper utilization of educational resource. The emulation of factory productivity fostered the development of standardized tests, and the standardized test was used to measure the effectiveness of the teacher, right? And at the expense of teaching sometimes. So this factory model approach has affected the design of curriculum, assessment, and instructional practices, and it's still prevalent today. It is unnerving to know that a person considered a pioneer in education believed that education could have no impact on a child's ability. As unnerving as it may seem, these ideas still govern how students are educated in schools today, and how they're sorted and how they perform on standardized tests and curriculum designed for the average student. So this is our friend, Thorndike. Yes. Yes. Primarily. Yeah. Although a lot of what we have done in the United States has percolated into other school systems as well. But yes, this is primarily in the United States. So who is this average person anyway? We've all come to believe that average is a reliable index of normality, right? But who is this average person? The average man is a very prominent figure and is used as a combined simplified means, oversimplified means of describing the combined characteristics of a very varied population, right? And we all know that there's the myth of the average learner. If you really want to learn more about that, there's a really good TED Talk by Todd Rose, and he wrote a book called The End of Average. And the 17-minute TED Talk is amazing. You should really watch it because it really establishes the fact that variability is the norm, that our students are not one-dimensional, right, from struggling to gifted. And that, he gives a really good example of the Air Force, the United States Air Force, and how they were having really a lot of problems with their planes, and how the Air Force pushed back when they realized that the problem was actually in the cockpit. The cockpit was designed for the average man at that point. And they said, well, let's kind of maybe get new average man measurements. When they did that, they measured 4,000 pilots on 10 dimensions of size. What they found was that no one was average on all 10 dimensions. And so what the Air Force did then was they said, no, well, you're going to have to design to the edges. the companies that were manufacturing cockpits said, well, that's not possible because it's very expensive. Well, the Air Force did not back down. They said, you're going to have to do this. And what they did at that time is responsible for adjustable seats that we take for granted today, right? And what it proved was that variability is the norm, right? Next slide. And so when you think of variability, was there a question? Okay. So when you think of variability as the norm, what do you then base your environments on? You actually think of the science of individuality. And again, Todd Rose has done a really good job of pulling this together in that book. And he talks about 3 principles. Context really matters, right? And think of it as an if-then principle. And the next one was the jaggedness profile. Jaggedness just means that no one is one-dimensional. Our students are not one-dimensional from struggling to gifted. They vary, there's multi-dimensions. They vary on background knowledge, language, experiences, interests, memory, reading levels, etc., right? And the other one is pathways principle. This is the whole idea of equifinality, right? That there's multiple ways to get to any one goal, and that no one way is better than the other. And the way that might be good for you is based on your own individuality, right? All right. Language matters. And so for all our students, there's different ways in which we talk about our students, learning differences, learning disabilities, person with a disability, which is the identity for a person first language. There are many groups that prefer the identity first language. And, for example, you have deaf and blind folks who prefer identity first, some autistic youth prefer the identity first language. So what do we do in that case, right? I think it's best to ask. And in gatherings like this, we tend to use both in order so that we can honor whatever is the language preference. Right. Next slide. Okay. It's time to disrupt and see how can we disrupt these ableist ideologies? How can we move away from the notion of the average learner, knowing that variability is the norm? How do we ensure that all our students get access, have ability to meaningfully participate, and have the support structures that are necessary for them to be fully included in their classrooms? This is a really good quote that Callie actually found an article, and we were looking at this together. And this is really not about blame, right? But rather developing an increasingly sophisticated awareness of the assumptions about disability that have been absorbed by all citizens simply by being in this world. We've all been socialized into thinking in certain ways, right? And a lot of that has been based on the fact that we live our lives largely based on the medical model, right? And special education in particular is based on the medical model. We seek to diagnose, treat, or cure. And what do we always say in IEP meetings? Needs drives goals, drives services, right? Next slide.
I was just going to say one. Yes. I just wanted to add a little editorial comment here, which is one of the things that did drive me to want to do this presentation with Lakshmi was my own wanting to learn more about ableism. It was a word that I had heard, and I always was asking myself, am I being ableist in this context or in this, if I do this, is that ableist or is that, and really wanted to explore that. And it's not always comfortable. And I guess I just want to let you know, like, it's not always comfortable, and we're not trying to make anyone feel uncomfortable, but we are in that space of learning and growing together. So as you were talking, I was like, that was really what inspired me, was wanting to get more comfortable with ableism, with my own ableism, with the ableism I see internalized in my kids and all the kids we work with in our nonprofit. And so I just want to acknowledge this can be an uncomfortable topic, and it's okay if we're uncomfortable together.
Sometimes I joke and say, I might step on your toes, and it's totally intentional. No, it's not. Oh, all right. All right. I think ableism. Okay, thank you. So when viewed through the lens of ableism, actions that seem considerate and pragmatic, that is refraining from disturbing general education, um, you know, are shown to be based on a devaluing of students, specifically decisions of whose academic progress matters, who deserves engaging academic environments, and what accommodations are important, right? And this whole idea of, well, if the student is sitting in the general education classroom, that's inclusion. Let them just breathe the same air, but breathing the same air is not inclusion, right? We have to think about what are we doing to provide access? How are they meaningfully participating? And I get this a lot, and I'm sure many of you in this room do as well. What about the rest of the kids? But what about my student, right? When will anyone stop to think about them as well as students who, and I had this told to me one time, well, she's not really going to do much after high school, is she? I was like, do you have a crystal ball? How do we know anybody is what they're going to do after high school? We are here as teachers and educators to provide access, to provide support, to teach, to help them make meaning. And what anyone chooses to do is their own business, right? Um, anyways. So, example of ableism, general education and special education. This is a pet peeve of mine. Why do we have two different tracks? And I know why we have that. So I'm not arguing with that. I understand the political implications, but the very fact that we have special education implies that there is something special that these educators in the teacher credentialing program are learning that general educators don't have. And hence, general education teachers tend to think that, well, I am not trained in that, so I'm going to reach out to the special ed. So maybe it's not my problem, right? And so those are ways in which society has socialized us into thinking that there are differences. And that is one of the ways in which, ableism manifests in the systems as well. Next slide. Do you want to read this one? Thank you.
We just were really struck by the way this author wrote things, and we couldn't improve upon it in any way. So we'll just share another one of these quotes. This author said, reading between the lines reveals an acceptance that there is a normal learner and there are normal bodies who have the ability to thrive while others are incapable. Recognizing ableism means redefining normal and committing to the belief that student variable is not a surprise, but is the norm. The special general education binary must be questioned because the line between special and ordinary is amorphous. And ableism has offered only two positions for students with disabilities: as deficient and needing intervention, or as inspirational and needing admiration.
All right. Here's another example of ableism, which is, functioning. Oh, he's high functioning or he's low functioning. Or they, instead, why not think of it as levels of support, right? Like a student might need a more level of support in a particular class, but they may be able to do really well in another context. So instead of thinking of them as high functioning and low functioning, because again, that casts aspersions on their intellectual ability and capability, it might be good to reframe our thinking in thinking of it as levels of support, right? And I think that, again, a lot of this is based on the medical model where we think of the deficit as residing in the person, as that there's something in the person that needs to be fixed. But if you really think about it, disability exists at the intersection of the individual and the environment, and we have to think about how contexts are disabling, right? It's not all in the person. And, for example, a lot of times we do interventions on the particular kid. Oh, well, he doesn't have social skills, so we're going to teach him how to say hello and how to, and nothing wrong with that, right? But how about we work also with the context, with this peer group on how to better support students who are neurodivergent, who may be socialized differently, because there is no norm. Next slide.
These are on your table if you want to take a look at them. We're going to ask you to do an activity with them.
These are examples of some ableist statements. There, you can see how I myself have internalized ableism. I can't even use that. So, um,
Do you want me to read through some of them, or
would you like
I don't know if you want to explain any of them.
Yeah, maybe read a few of them.
Yeah, so these are ones that you find in general society that people are saying, and we really need to be cautious about our language and careful. Like, so you're acting bipolar. What a schizo. The one I find myself saying a lot that I have to watch myself is, oh, that's just crazy. I say that all the time, and I have to be, oh no, I need to actually describe the situation. I need to not, rely on this term. Turning a blind eye, or you don't look disabled. You're tone deaf. That fell on deaf ears. Yeah. Doesn't your problem have a cure? Even though you have a disability, you seem normal. Or I wonder if your children will be born normal, or that's a blind spot.
I actually been asked that a lot. Oh, sorry. I've been asked that a lot because, my, I think my disability was diagnosed when I was 12 or 13. And a very well-meaning auntie once told me that I think it's probably best you don't get married and have kids because you don't want to, like give your disability down to your kids. I was like, thanks, aunt. But no. So these are, examples of things that get said to people. And I think it's really important to kind of watch our language. And, someone told me, well, but I'm used to saying blindsided. Well, I said, well, get used to go look at Chat GPT and ask Chat GPT to give you another word for that. And so
That's how. So
yes.
that reminds me of a personal story when our oldest daughter came out to us as first non-binary. She came in and said, Dad, I know you're not comfortable with they, them, and the grammar that involves, but you better get used to it.
So you might want to explain the next activities. So, yeah. All right.
You want me to explain this one?
Yes, please.
This is our first time. I think we're doing pretty well for our first time doing this. So when we were doing our background research for the presentation, we came across this university ableism bingo that was put together by a university professor who's disabled. And she really wanted to get into this idea that there's a lot of things we're saying at the university level. And we took that as inspirational to come up with K-12 bingo statements. And these are also on your table. And I think I did put a link to them, both of these in the Padlet. I hope I did. If not, I will. I might not have actually. That's the one you guys said I didn't, right? I'm keeping a list over here. So if you see something else you want in the Padlet, don't hesitate to speak up. I'll add it. But Lakshmi looked at the bingo list and said, you know what? I can do that like that for K-12. So she came up with a list of statements like they just need to try harder, or I'm not equipped to deal with special needs. Why can't they just sit still? They're using their disability as an excuse. They're too disruptive for group work. They need to learn to overcome their challenges. If we accommodate them now, how will they cope later in life? So there's this list of different statements. And what we'd like you to do is at your table, turn and talk to one another. Pick one ableist sentence. So that was the ones we saw before that are used more in the general environment, and one bingo topic, and just talk how you might reframe some of those to disrupt ableism. And we'd love you to write your reframing. And we've put up on the sticky notes, we've put up these posters throughout the room. Sorry, Zoom, I'm going off camera. I know. And we're going to have 4 different activities. And at the end, we'll have it all filled up with your colorful thoughts. This one will go in the one that's on this one labeled bingo, or in that one, other one's labeled language, because I realized as I put these together this morning, what we're really doing is talking about how we can disrupt ableism through language, through context, through strengths, and through our practices. So we'll give you guys about 2 or 3 minutes to turn and talk about these, and look forward to seeing your colorful posts on the board. Great. Thank you all so much. I love hearing the learning and the sharing going on in the room. You're welcome to add those later. We're going to move on now and talk a little bit about some ableism disruptors. And one of those is really taking a new lens, putting a new lens on things ourselves. And then by doing so, we'll look at the context that we're working in differently. So A lot of times when I do workshops, I like to do a pre-survey to find out what people already know, and I wasn't able to do that for this one. So I just want to make sure that we're on the same page about a definition around neurodiversity, because that is a lens that you can use to disrupt some of that socialized ableism that we've all been subject to. And the definition that we use for neurodiversity in our organization is that it's an umbrella term, and it's really recognizing that we all have unique brains. Everyone has a unique brain, and that among us, there are actually a variety of neurotypes, and that there's an actual benefit to society by having this variety of neurotypes. And so then you might hear people who have been identified as having ADHD or being autistic or dyslexic or dyscalculic or dysgraphic as being neurodivergent. So someone who has one of these is considered neurodivergent. And someone who is not identified with one of these, it doesn't mean they don't have one, but if they are not identified and do not have one of these neurodivergences, then they are considered to be neurotypical or neuronormative. But we are all neurodiverse together. Everyone in this room, we are a neurodiverse group of people. And thank goodness for it. And back to what Lakshmi was saying. Oh, that's, yeah, either way is fine. Yeah, sure. What Lakshmi was saying before is how we think about disability really matters. And Lakshmi was referring to the biomedical model that really has been in place for the last century. And it really sees disability as a problem. It's something that's different from the norm, and we need to identify it, fix it, cure it, solve it, diagnose, eliminate. And our special education law is really largely built on a system of this biomedical model where we identify students. They have to be officially diagnosed and impacted. And it really places that disability in the person as a problem. And we can click the next button, please. What we saw in the last 40 or so years is really a shift to the social paradigm. And Lakshmi talked about this some too as well, is that this idea that it's that intersection of the person and their environment. And so we got those special education laws, a lot of it was parents who were coming out and saying, no, it's not that my child can't do these things, it's that they're not being afforded these opportunities. So we should really think about society and how society is causing the problem. That problem does not live within the person, it's within how we are treating the person or the way we're designing our systems. So we can support and accommodate people who have these differences to participate more in our society. And the neurodiversity movement has really come more into being in the last 20 years, where we're looking at differences as the norm. And we really want to affirm them. And we want to look at each person for who they are and focus on their wellness and what uniquely helps them function and be successful in the world for themselves as who they are, and actually listening to them. So the neurodiversity movement really puts neurodivergent people at the center and says their voices are the important voices to listen to. And they can help us to find what is beneficial and success for them. And I know you had a few things you wanted to add here.
Right. I just wanted to add a few things to the whole idea of the social context, right? If we pause for a second and rest our thoughts on disability and context, as in what is disabling, right? And what is subjugating is the society that does the subjugation, right? It's disabled bodies don't oppress the disabled. It's a society that does the oppression, because we plant a diagnosis, and by doing so, we let society off the hook. But really what we need to do is we need to pause and see how our context disabling. How does disability exist at that intersection of the individual and the environment? And I'm not saying that impairment is not real, right? Like I can't see at night, that is an impairment. But who does the oppression, right?
Yeah, next slide. So there's just a metaphor we like to use to sort of think this through, and thinking about it in the context of playgrounds is kind of a fun way to do that. So if we think about the way playgrounds were designed throughout the 20th century, they looked a lot like this, sometimes even worse. Sometimes they were just like bars pulled together, like who could really access that, especially when girls were required to wear skirts to school. I mean, there was just so many things about old playgrounds that are inaccessible. You know, they're metal, they're hot, you have to be able to climb. So, you know, you can't climb, I'm sorry, you don't get to participate at recess in these activities. Maybe you're someone, if you're neurodivergent, you don't like jostling, you don't like being close to other bodies, the noise of people. And so I'm sorry, you also can't participate. And so this is that kind of medical model that says, this is the normal way. You either adapt to this or you just are out of luck. Then we saw kind of a movement towards this kind of playground in like the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. We probably all saw these kinds of playgrounds. You know, they're better. You know, they have some activities that are lower to the ground, but they're not the most interesting activities. The most interesting activities are still the ones that you have to climb up and interact with in a very specific way, with very specific way your body works. So we're getting a little better, but now what we're seeing more is this explosion of the magical bridge playgrounds. I don't know if you guys have seen these around our community, but these are completely accessible playgrounds. They're actually designed with disabled people in mind, with them in participation. And so what you see are multiple ways to get to the fun things that everyone can access, structures for imagination and creativity that anyone can use if they're so inspired to do it, things that integrate all different kinds of sensory systems. The best part about these, when you come at it from kind of that neurodiversity mindset, everyone loves these. These places are packed. Teenagers go there. Mark Zuckerberg couldn't get to the one in Palo Alto during COVID because you had to sign up because it was so backed up. I mean, these are very engaging when we design with the neurodivergent person at the center, when we let them have a voice in how things are designed and structured. They're able to participate, they're able to be part of it, and we all are better off. And one of the reasons this really matters in an education context is we were speaking with a local school district leader who asked us to come in and do a workshop because she said parents literally say this to her, my IEP meeting, it's the worst day of a parent's year. It's the worst day of my year. The day I'm supposed to go in and talk to my team about my child, set the goals for that child, talk about who they can become. They're not having that experience because we haven't yet quite moved out of that medicalized model that spends a lot of time talking about the deficits and setting our goals around deficits and not thinking about it from the perspective of the child and what they will value and what will help them grow as a person and a learner. So that all comes together, and I think we all want to do better. Clearly, that school district wants to do better. They're very concerned. And so disrupting ableism can be a key part of what we're bringing into those meetings and how we're approaching those children and their families. So we want to have a little move and stand activity. I don't know if you're getting too comfortable where you are. It's not a super large room, so if you want to stay at your table, I'm going to let Lakshmi explain this activity while I get the papers ready.
Okay. So what we have is we have a few scenarios, elementary and secondary. So depending on, and these are examples of student issues, barriers that they faced, all well, students that I've worked with. And so I'll be able to tell you what happened. So we'd like you to kind of discuss in groups. So if you're an elementary educator or work in elementary contexts, go to how.
No, I didn't put signs up. We could have
put signs up. Okay.
Raise your hand if you're an elementary educator. Raise your hand if you're secondary. I mean, you're kind of generally clustered. Yeah, did you gravitate towards one another? I mean, I could just go around to each table and ask them which they prefer.
Okay, perfect. Yes. So what we're going to do is you're going to have a scenario and there are questions right after the scenario. So we'd like you to take a few minutes, read the scenario independently, and then answer the questions together as a table. So depending on whether you choose elementary or secondary, you'll get a scenario based on that. Sound okay? Yes? Okay. And this is just to kind of give us an idea. I use this activity with my teacher candidates at Stanford. So I teach in the teacher education program and I work with general education teachers. And I use these kinds of activities to help them understand and unpack what is happening. What are the barriers? What are the facilitators? What are resources that are available that maybe the education team is not using yet. So I'd love to hear what you all come up with as well. Thank you.
All right, we're going to give you about 1 more minute to wrap up. If you have had a chance to think about a contextual barrier in your own environment or from the case scenario that you'd like to add to the context wall, feel free. Just take about 20, 30 more seconds and finish up. All right, before we move on, we have time for maybe 1 or 2 tables just to share out your discussion and your thoughts around what we could change about the context of the scenario. Would any table like to volunteer to share out? Or was there anything from our online folks that we want to share out? Sure, yeah.
Oh, yes, of course. I need the mic. We were looking at the elementary school and the TK through 5. So we expect children to be able to sit in the classroom quietly during large group activities. We often don't allow them to stand or move around, even though they might need to. And someone said we often consider our own needs as teachers rather than student needs. So I need the class to be quiet so I can regulate myself rather than what do the kids need to regulate themselves. Yeah.
Anybody here want to share what they discussed and maybe a secondary scenario? Oh,
Over there.
okay.
I feel like Oprah.
We discussed that why do they have to sit on a rug? Why not allow them to sit at their desks or go outside on the field or just do it in a different spot? Doing like a movement break beforehand to get all their energy out and doing a movement break in between for the specific child, and really all the students like preview the book. Like for example, if it was brown bear, every kid could have an animal, and like when their animal's coming up, they stand up with their animal, make it interactive, use puppets, like make it fun instead of just sit on this carpet and listen to me.
That was a TK. You guys had a TK scenario, I think, right? Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah.
Yeah. We had a student that was a 9th grader that was having a really hard time completing writing assignments, complaining of arm pain. So, and he got in some trouble. So we talked about the barriers where didn't seem to be any positive behavior support in the classroom, rewarding him and reinforcing him for doing any writing. And also resources. We talked about assistive technology was a resource for him, or alternative response. And the same for UDL, AT, typing his assignment, alternate response, voice to text. So putting those things in place.
Awesome. Great.
Thank you. And these are just to kind of, these are just to kind of help you get that thought process going, and feel free to use these if you're doing PD to kind of help the group start to kind of brainstorm. It also is a nice way to kind of get the attention off the teacher, and because you're looking at somebody else, right? And so that is sometimes super helpful.
All right. So we are going to breeze through this next section, which is about how we can use strengths to disrupt ableism, because really viewing kids through their strengths can really help us see them differently. So, there's a quote that we like to use at the beginning of all of our workshops about human beings and what we as all human beings have the potential to be, just that we all have the potential to be great in our own unique way. And we also need to be great in our own unique way. We need to be great and relevant so we can be happy and psychologically healthy and have a strong sense of self-worth. And that's every human being, all of you, all the children you work with. So this comes from Dr. Yang Zhao, who's a special education professor at the University of Kansas. And it really is a lens that we use to look at everyone, that everyone has a right to these things. And it's really for our mental wellness. So it's not always looking at, are they going to be a great worker? Are they going to get a job? Are they going to, it's really about how are they feeling about themselves? Do they have good mental health and wellness to make it through everything that life throws your way, right? So we want to look at some of this in the context of some of the frameworks that we're using in schools to organize our work and to organize our thinking about students. So I think probably most everyone is familiar with the response to intervention framework. And in this framework, it's primarily looking at weaknesses. Again, it's sort of back to that medical model. Are they going to be okay in general education classroom so they get their tier 1? Are they someone who needs that tier 2 intervention around a deficit area? Even further, a tier 3 intervention around a deficit area. It's a very deficit-based triangle, even though it's colorful and pretty. It's right. It's really about where are we slotting kids based on what they can't do and how they're not responding to that baseline general education, factory, normal, average, typical model. And this is based on this idea, we've created this whole list of age-based expectations. This is what you should be able to do when you're 6. This is what you should be able to do when you're 12. This is how we think your social emotional skills should look at those ages. This is how we think we should be seeing your executive function coming online. That doesn't happen, right? Like in such a nice, typical way. These are the academic skills we think you'll have. And so we sort of think about kids in this neurotypical way, that they're going to come online with these skills in an age-based way. Obviously not all at the line, right? I mean, there's some variability, but it's within a range of reasonable, and that's how we designed that tier 1 classroom. But if we look at a dyslexic student, for instance, what we might notice is their social development is coming online as we expect. They seem to have relatively okay executive function, but wow, those reading and writing skills are behind. They need to have a tier 2 intervention, maybe a tier 3. And we're also seeing like their math is actually affected because we do so much reading and writing and math now that because they're struggling in this area, it's impacting their math skills. So maybe we think there's something wrong in math when really it's just that we're taxing that reading and writing capability within that content area. So this is more how we think about kids in these age-based ways and how they get split into those tiers. So there are some places, has anyone seen this one? This version? Some people, little mix. There are some places that are now actually thinking about our tiers on both the enrichment side as well as the intervention side. So they flip that model around and say, yes, there are some kids who all their needs can be met in the tier 1 classroom, but we actually need to have those interventions, tier 2 and tier 3 on the remedial side. And then we need to do enrichment supports on the other side. So that's a little bit different, right? We start thinking about kids from that strength-based lens. There's a problem with this too, because is a kid always this or are they always that? Right? Like, where are they when, and have they been put in a box, and can they get over to that side? Are they ever given those chances? So we could actually conceptualize this differently as more of a grid, and we can say a child in this level is, they actually in their enrichment tier, they're doing okay with the reading, that instruction they're getting in their classroom, but they're struggling with dysgraphia, so they might need an intervention. So maybe they're more of an intervention tier 3, or maybe they are struggling with dysgraphia, so they're an intervention tier 3, but they really know a lot about history. So they're actually in this box for that. So we can start to think about kids as being all over, at different times, different contexts, different subjects, different strengths. But the challenge here is there's still boxes, right? They're still being put in a box. So we really want to encourage us all to get out of those boxes and really see kids for all the things that they are, the variety of strengths and interests and challenge areas they have. We can't ignore the challenges. Of course, we want to shore that up, but are we paying attention enough? Is enough energy going into those other areas? So one of the things we talk a lot about in our work is really building on a foundation of strengths and interests based on what we think that child can be. So frequently what can happen when parents and students and teachers are interacting is they can get in a tug of war about like whose priorities matter more, and they start arguing with each other and they're not working together. But if we can flip that up and actually start to think about what could this child be? What is the potential of this child? Where do they want to be great? What gets them going every day? What's going to make them want to show up at school every day? Then we can actually all focus our goals on that. And then if we think about the fact that children may need interventions, they may need accommodations in order to fill in some of those areas where they have some weaknesses, but can we build it all on strengths and interests? Can we make sure that is infusing all of our conversations about what we're doing so that that child is living more in a space of what's possible and not just what is hard for them all the time? So really thinking about those strengths starts to disrupt kind of some of the ableist mindsets that we all have fallen into because of the way we've been educated and raised. We at Real have come up with a 4-pedal model to think about this. So we really focus on the importance of developing a connection with a child because you can't really know their strengths and interests unless you know the child. We also talk about that embracing of flexibility, which I know you guys know a lot about from UDL and how important that is. But UDL can also be a strong motivator for the third piece, which is attending to those strengths. If we don't attend to these strengths, these kids are not going to find that intrinsic motivation and reason to come to school and to thrive in life, quite honestly. And then reframing the behaviors, which we see sometimes in these contextual scenarios. But we feel like a lot of these get covered in other places, but that attending to strengths, there's not always as core a place for that to happen in the work that we see. And so it's really a critical part of disrupting ableism is seeing the potential in every kid. So we have an activity, but I think because we're a little short on time, I am going to encourage you to do this activity on your own. Most of you have a copy of it at your table. Some of you, I mentioned I didn't have enough copies, but I did post it on the Padlet. It's really hard to think about a child's strengths if you don't know your own. And I think it's really important for educators to know their own strengths and interests and to weave that into the work you do because it's more joyful for you. And there's also evidence that shows when educators and students are working together in their strength areas, it just really elevates the whole experience. And with so much teacher burnout right now, like we all need to find those sources of joy for ourselves. So I really encourage you to do this activity where you just take a few minutes and brainstorm what you excel at. Brainstorm what you're excited about, and then brainstorm what you enjoy. And then if you see patterns, you can see sort of those strengths and interests that might make sense for you to develop further in your own life. And this is an easy activity to do with kids. You can just talk to them about it. They can be little and you can gather the information. And we do have it available electronically if you want to do it. And I wish we had time to do it today. If before you leave, you want to jot down one of your strengths or interests and add it to the board, please do. But we're gonna keep trucking because we only got about 10 minutes left.
All right. So now we're going to go to the last part of the presentation, which is how do you leverage UDL, right? Universal Design for Learning. And from what I understand, you've had quite a few presentations on UDL. So we're not going to go into depth about UDL, but I really want to set the context for, are we clarifying goals, before we begin teaching, right? So so what is your goal? So I'm going to play along with me, please. And this is an example from CAST. So I'm going to tell all of you that we're going to all do more sit-ups. Ready? You don't see me doing it. So now you might ask me, why should I do more sit-ups? And then I tell you, we're all going to get fit by doing sit-ups. That sounds reasonable. To get fit by doing sit-ups. But really, what is my goal here? Is it to get fit? Or is it to do sit-ups, to do more sit-ups? But really, my goal is to get fit. So if my goal is to get fit, why do I need to tell you how to get fit? Yeah. There's so many different ways in which you can get fit, right? And I also want to really acknowledge that these look these images are, leaning towards very skinny bodies. And I think that that's not inclusive, but it was a really good example, so I'm using it. But I want to acknowledge what is not there. So if our goal is to get fit, and I don't need to tell you exactly how to do that, then you have agency and choice in how you do this. And this is really to say that clear goals with flexible means reduces barriers, right? So if the goal is to get fit and you give choice on how to get there, then we're reducing the amount of barriers that we're inadvertently putting up for people. Next slide. All right. So start with clarifying questions. So let's look at this example in our educational context. Students will write a 3-paragraph essay to demonstrate their understanding of the metamorphosis of butterflies. Seems reasonable, right? Is the goal too specific? Why should, and I'm doing this really quickly, right? So is the goal specific? It actually is, right? If so, is the how embedded? It is embedded. They will write a 3-paragraph essay. Does it need to be? Is the question. Now, how can we scaffold or support the learning to reduce barriers? That's the question we want to ask. And for that, we need to unpack the goal. Now, if the goal is to demonstrate understanding of the metamorphosis, do they need to write a 3-paragraph essay? Is it a writing goal or is it a content goal? So that's how we unpack it. So next slide. So you unpack standards, separate goals, and remove barriers. There are 2 goals in there. There's a knowledge goal and there is a skill goal. Now, I'm not saying that writing a 3-paragraph essay is not important, but when we're teaching that, let's have students have agency on what they write about, right? And if it is a knowledge goal that we're looking at, which is demonstrating understanding of metamorphosis, I can do an interpretive dance. Trust me. We could draw a poster. We could do a diagram. There are so many ways. We could do a recording, an audio recording. So if we allow that agency, I think then we reduce barriers. And here's the other thing that we do. Let's say in 7th grade history, we say that, oh, students will write a 5-paragraph essay to talk about the Civil War. All right, month 1, that was the assessment. Student who's not good at writing, teacher's going to think they don't know Civil War. Month 2, students will write a 5-paragraph essay to demonstrate understanding of next topic. By the end of the year, the student has failed history, not because they don't know history, but because the way we assessed their knowledge was not aligned with how their strengths were being leveraged. So something to think about. All right, so what is UDL? Universal Design for Learning is a framework to improve and optimize teaching and learning by removing barriers in the environment. Really thinking about how do we examine the context, look at the barriers, clear goals, do we have clear goals, and how do we give flexible means, right? Next slide. So these are the 3 principles. I'm not going to go into it, but I think, how many of you all know that the 3.0 has come out? Right? Do you all know what the changes are? All right, good. So the 3.0 guidelines, these are the changes. It maintains the 3 main categories of engagement, representation, and action and expression. Each category now has 3 levels, which are access, support, and executive function. It uses design multiple means of instead of provide multiple means of, so that emphasis has shifted. And subcategories uses design options for. So those are some of the changes in kind of the bigger picture. Next slide. Okay, so in our deck, it talks about exactly what the changes are. And I'm actually in the process of writing up a document about how this is what are the impacts of these changes, right? Like in terms of welcoming identity, what is the impact of that? So the next 3 slides go into that, and let's go into the last one. Yes, dive into the guidelines. So at your table, you all have a copy of the guidelines. And this is something we just wanted to do as a reflective activity, because we know and understand that many of you actually know the UDL guidelines really, really well. But maybe look and see what is one thing that you do well today, and what is one thing that you might want to set a goal for you to improve on, right? Under engagement, representation, or action and expression. and, turn and talk to your neighbor about your choices and jot each one down on a note and put it in the designated area. So if you're able to do that, that's great. But we would really like you to reflect on what are some things you already do well and what is maybe one area for improvement.
It's going to be speed. I'm sorry, we always need more time. I know.
It's B Lakshmi. Oh.
Let's just change that right now. I bet when I copy it, I just missed that. All right. I know everyone's going to be ready to go to lunch, and we've reached the end of our time together. But I do want to let you know that Dr. Balasubramanian and I are here. If you have questions, you can reach out to us at any time.
Yeah, giving away the AI tool. I also want to make a plug for one of the things our lab is giving away. So as I said earlier, I work in one of the learning labs at Stanford, and we are designing a tool for reading comprehension, and we are giving it away. So if you email me, I'll give you access to the tool. It's a really cool tool. It uses an octopus named Kai. Kai means ocean. And it's a tool for helping students. Right now, we're focused on informational text, on comprehending informational text using an evidence-based strategy called Getting the Gist. And it's an AI tool that's responsive to student, has been trained on, the LLM has been trained on special ed and disability studies. So if you email me, I'll give you access. And yes, that's it. And
yeah, I would say because we didn't have time for Q&A like we had hoped. This is our first time doing this, so I think there's a feedback form for the conference. So please, if you have any suggestions for improvements or things that you love that we shouldn't lose, because I know we'd love to do this again in the future with other educators. And so please do fill that out, and we'll ask the organizers to get us that information, or we'll be here and we're happy to come up and answer any questions. Yes. I also, before I do that, I just want to close before you go out into the world and say it's overwhelming sometimes. We cover a lot of information. There are a lot of ideas, and you can't do it all at once. And I think we just want to acknowledge that. I love Emmanuel Acho, who's like a motivational speaker, who says, just because you can't do everything, don't let that stop you from doing anything. Just put one foot in front of the other and do something. Even a little thing makes a big difference. So, but don't put so much pressure on yourself to be perfect. No one is perfect every day, all the time. We're